Welcome to Health Bites. Thank you everyone for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Ibraheem Ali. Dr. Ali is the Sciences Data Librarian at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Ali completed his bachelor's in biology at California State University Fresno and his PhD in Biomedical Sciences at UCSF, and his postdoc focusing on epigenetics and transcription regulation at the J David Gladstone Institutes. In his current role, he teaches data visualization methodologies for biosciences researchers, provide advising on various issues in scholarly communication, and provides data management support to research labs. His research and services focus on identifying and implementing inclusive archiving solutions for research labs and best practices for preprints, data and methods publishing for preclinical and clinical researchers. In today's Health Bites, Dr. Ali will give a presentation on unpacking the role of preprints in peer-reviewed scholarly inclusion. Thank you, Dr. Ali, for being our guest speaker this morning, and I will turn everything over to you.
Thank you so much, Edward, for the fantastic introduction. If you want to do the transition over to the slides, I will be happy to control the slides. 1 second as I share my screen. I think you can probably see my notes. I'll go in this presenter mode. Oops, I need presenter mode. And full screen. All right, so shall we just jump in, Edward? Does that sound good?
Yes, that will be perfect.
All right, well, hi everyone. I want to start us off by first thanking the organizers, especially Edward, for inviting me to speak and participate in this seminar series. Glancing through some of the talks in this series, I feel really lucky to be featured on this lineup. So I really appreciate that. And of course, the introduction that you gave. Just to very quickly recap, my name is Ibraheem Ali. I'm the Sciences Data Librarian at UCLA. I first started working in research, in biological research at Fresno State, where I completed my bachelor's in 2013. So I started around 2009. I then went directly to get my PhD in biomedical sciences at UCSF, which I finished in 2018, and then did a about 1 year postdoc at the Gladstone Institutes in 2019. So I've been in biological and biomedical research for about 10 years now. And I have been kind of learning lessons along the way that got me really invested in talking about preprints, especially as we think about diversity and inclusion in academic institutions. So really quickly, as I get started, and Edward, thank you for highlighting some of the duties that I work on at UCLA. As I navigated my graduate degree, I found myself frequently in conflict with the dominant modes by which we define excellence and progress in academia. I found that while I was publishing cutting edge and impactful biomedical research, no one in my family could understand the jargon that I had to use to sound professional. I helped my PI write dozens of peer reviews, and even she didn't get credit, let alone getting credit for my time or effort. So when I wanted to publish my work as a preprint to see how the field would respond to my efforts instead of working in isolation, I was originally told that I was throwing my career away, but it actually has helped me out quite a bit, and we'll talk about some of the lessons learned along that process. So really the core theme of this talk is as we think about our institutions and as we continue to grapple with the concepts of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, we must consider the history of our institutions and think deeply about how we define productivity and impact along the medical or biomedical research workflow. So with that preamble, I'm going to get started with unpacking the role of preprints and peer review in scholarly inclusion. So as a quick overview for our session today, we're going to take a look at the process of peer review or refereeing of scholarship. We're going to look at some of the historical context of peer review and the benefits and drawbacks of the current system of peer review. We're going to take a close look at the research life cycle in STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math. especially with a focus on biosciences research, which is my background. But we can talk about some of the other themes as well if it comes up. And we're going to look at several fundamental steps of the research process that can be published and cited without undergoing peer review. And finally, we will finish by discussing on how these developments expand the space for scholarly discourse, accelerate research, and make scholarship more inclusive. So as we begin, a good place to start is with an overview and the history of peer review as we see it in the current academic infrastructure. And many folks may already know some of this history, but I'm just going to review it for the viewers and for anyone who is not familiar. So before going into the historical context, I'm just going to quickly define terms for the purposes of this talk just to kind of simplify this process. So first, I'm going to define peer review. And this is the process where experts of a field evaluate scholarship before acceptance in a scholarly journal. Peer review is used for a number of things outside of journal publishing, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to keep it limited to the discussion of acceptance in scholarly journals. And then I'm going to define preprints, which is a complete and public draft of an unreviewed scientific document, and interim research products, which I think of it as like a cousin to preprints, which are complete public research products that are not final, for example, methods or raw data. And importantly, I pulled the definitions from preprints and interim research products from an NIH notice that some of the folks on this call might be familiar with, the NIH notice ID that's listed here in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. It was a notice in 2017 that essentially stated that grant writers can cite preprints in their NIH like grants and renewals as like means of productivity, which I think is a first step in bringing these into the discussion of the scholarly dialogue. Okay, so with those definitions, currently, and as many of us know, peer review is the gold standard for evaluating, and I'm going to call it dominant scholarship for now, and we'll talk about that in a second. So when we consider inclusion in scholarship, we need to understand that through the process of colonialism in the last few centuries, many systems of intellectual and scientific inquiry that existed, some for literally hundreds or thousands of years before conquest, were systematically erased. American indigenous civilizations, Chinese and Indian civilizations, Middle Eastern and African civilizations had great bodies of knowledge, especially that related to medicine and health, many of which were destroyed in the process of conquest or systematically ignored in the current westernized medical infrastructure. And while technological advances in the last century have completely changed the framework for by which we consider health, one only needs to turn to the literature to see how Western and European scientists still search for that next small molecule inhibitor and the roots, herbs, and spices used in the past for medicine. So with this in mind, the dominant infrastructure for research is actually quite new, only a few hundred years old, and the process of evaluating that research is even newer. In the Western system of research and scientific inquiry, a substantial body of scholarship was solely evaluated by an editor who had the ultimate say on publication of scholarship. In this system, peer review was first introduced in 1731 by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, but not widely adopted in the journals that we see in use today until around World War II. And to give you a couple of examples, peer review was adopted in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, in 1940, and it was adopted by Lancet in 1976. So quite late in the grand scheme of generating scholarly content. And this method of, and now that it has been introduced, this method of peer review is now widely accepted across research disciplines for all kinds of academic decision-making, including tenure and advancement, allocation of grant funding, and in other spaces. The indigenous scholar Sean Wilson describes in his book, Research as Ceremony, a framework for evaluating scholarship which required the engagement and input of his entire indigenous community in order to evaluate the work. And even after all of this community engagement and input, he describes the challenge of getting this work accepted in our current academic framework because not enough dominant scholarship is cited. And so essentially highlighting the fact that if you can't publish with, or if you can't draw from sources in the Western system, then it is not defined as legitimate scholarship, even though the community that he worked with was very engaged. And right now, the current standard currently, journals expect 2 to 4 referees in related fields to evaluate any work that is submitted for publication. So instead of having entire communities involved in the research process and discussing the research involved, we're expecting 2 to 4 people to catch the major or minor flaws in the manuscript. And that leads us to some of the other challenges that have been introduced by this peer review system. So many folks acknowledge that it takes time and effort to create high quality and rigorously vetted scholarship. As such, many acknowledge that the peer review process can take time. However, often minor holdups in the peer review process can make the process take extremely long, which can be very difficult for authors who are in transient positions like graduate students, research assistants, or postdocs. So when a review process gets held up for a year, it can be extremely consequential for people who are trying to advance in the work that they're doing. Despite this lengthy process, 2 studies from the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1998 highlighted the fact that peer reviewers were only able to uncover a small fraction of major or minor flaws intentionally introduced into a manuscript. In the Callahan 1998 study, all of these citations are included in my presentation, and hyperlinks to them should be available in the PDF. So in the Callahan 1998 study, reviewers were on average able to identify 3 out of 10 major flaws and 3 out of 13 minor flaws of all of the research studies that were, or the peer reviews that were done. In the Godley study, they found 2 out of 8 major flaws were identified on average, with only 10% of reviewers identifying more than half of the introduced manuscript flaws. So clearly, peer review is still just scratching the surface on being able to identify issues, and having 3 reviewers is the very bare minimum to catch any of these major or minor flaws. In addition, a Nature study in 2017 of the American Geophysics Union, one of the largest and representative scientific societies, found that in this society, women were underrepresented as peer reviewers, editors, and authors among their journals, despite having higher acceptance rates in their first author papers. And the paper discusses some of the reasons why. And finally, unprofessional peer reviews are very common. Gerwing and colleagues in 2020 and 2021, in their studies of nearly 1,500 sets of reviewer comments, found that 41% of peer reviews contained incomplete, inaccurate, or unsubstantiated critiques, and 12% of comments included at least one unprofessional comment. And reading through those papers and seeing what unprofessional comments are listed is quite a sight to see. So I highly recommend folks check those out if you're curious of what kind of things get written into these single blind peer reviews. But ultimately, this highlights an immense challenge, especially for editors and people who manage review boards and selecting and maintaining reviewers, because there's so much kind of like less than productive peer review. It makes it ultimately hard to just manage the peer review process, let alone select for reviewers and all of that process. And then finally, the last study that I'm citing here talks about how these unprofessional reviews often disproportionately harm folks who are underrepresented in academic environments. In fact, the unprofessional review is such an integrated subculture in academia that there's literally a Twitter account dedicated to reviewer number 3, which is the reviewer that leaves those so-and-so toxic comments. So in this example, reviewer number 3, and this is a parody account. This is not necessarily real, but I think it illustrates the culture in academia that enables this kind of behavior. So this one says, this paper is more appropriate for a specialty journal, like one that specializes in terrible papers. And this is literally a comment that, not exactly, but the specializes or a specialty journal is one of the things that we would joke about as reviewers, kind of considering just reviewing in the context that I did back in grad school. My colleague Stephen Floor highlights this kind of cognitive dissonance that exists in some academic discourse here, saying some scientists talk about the importance of rigor and reproducibility, and then other scientists talk about how you can't use previously published data sets, making it kind of question entirely like why are we even why are we talking so much about reusability and reproducibility if we're not actually reusing the things that we created in the first place? And then there are some other jokes here that I don't need to necessarily go into, but I think the point is gotten across. So it goes without saying that our current system of education and scholarship has created impressive science and technology, virtually unimaginable for the greater part of the previous millennia. However, this does not change the fact that within the current system of science and scholarship, it was built on the subjugation and genocide of colonized peoples and systemic exclusion of people who think too far outside of the academy or royal societies in the 19th century Europe when a lot of this was popularized. In the case of healthcare and wellness, many of our major advances happened after the erasure of systems after the erasure of systems of health and well-being that were implemented in native Chinese and Indian civilizations for thousands of years, and in support of the commodification of healthcare in a primarily capitalistic society. While there are moments when it seems like society has shifted away somewhat from violent colonialism and cultural erasure, I can't help but reflect on some words of wisdom that were shared with me when I first started working in libraries, which is the only thing slower to change than academics are academic librarians. So we really need to seriously think about, are there ways to reduce the barriers in creating professional outputs in order to make scholarly communication more inclusive? Just 1 second, I have an alarm going off. Sorry about that. Now the question is, how do we prioritize our structures and values such that scholarship is more inclusive and primed for positive change? One place to start is by looking at the process of creating research and identify indicators of productivity that can be valued and how milestones in scholarship and learning are valued. In this section, I will review some basic steps of the research process used in STEM fields. And I was very lucky to work with some folks over at our studio, Greg Wilson and Sarah Lynn, on a publication that we put out on PLOS Computational Biology, talking about research workflows and making work more findable in the professional setting. So as many of us know, original research relies on unique or specialized data sources. In biological and biomedical labs, they often use model systems to extrapolate information that applies to health and medicine today. They have mouse lines. Some folks are familiar with fly and nematode research, single cell organisms, and often some research labs will use public data. And ultimately, research labs will apply specific methods or specialized tools on these model systems to extract research data. This information is recorded and categorized. In gold are some of the nuggets of data that contain observations that fit within a research hypothesis, and others maybe don't fit the research hypothesis highlighted here in this kind of grayish blue. Negative data or data from failed experiments is also recorded. This is just simply a process of research. This data that is collected is analyzed for patterns and summarized with statistics. And finally, publications are created by organizing and contextualizing the data into a manuscript draft, which is revised internally, either through the lab or their collaborators, but then through the peer review process is finalized and published as a bona fide journal article. And currently in our system, we most value these published articles, but more and more people are starting to acknowledge that each of these components here are contributions in scholarship. So far, we've talked about peer review as a process and some of its problems, and we've talked about the research process and various products that are created in the process of conducting research. Now let's talk about the rise of preprints and some of the initiatives that are ongoing to support these efforts. So the increase in preprint publishing grew dramatically in 2013, in part to the extremely slow rate at which research articles are published and the desire to address some of the flaws of the peer review system. Simultaneously, researchers in the biosciences have been grappling with what has been called a reproducibility crisis, which spawns partially from incomplete methods reporting for a variety of reasons, the imperfect nature of model systems used in biosciences research that I mentioned earlier, and publication bias, which is journals' preferences in publishing only novel findings or positive findings, so discoveries. In response to this, journals and funders have been calling for their authors to publish more of the raw data and methods so that others can verify the research that's being published in their manuscripts. And the need for rapid communication around developments in COVID-19 research led to a surge in preprint publishing. This boon has been recognized and discussed by the NIH in a variety of panels, and we are hearing more and more about the repositories that are publishing this content. However, what's interesting is that when investigating the rates at which preprints have been published in journals, one study published in MetaArchive pointed out that 50% of all COVID-19 related preprints were ultimately published in peer-reviewed journals within 9 months, and 29% were published within six months. As such, funders and publishers around the world are acknowledging the value of sharing final research data and methods in an open and transparent way. Most importantly, the cost to submit preprints or other interim research products like protocols and data are of low to no cost to the author, which vastly increases who is able to participate in the production of scholarship, especially in regions outside of North America and Western Europe. In addition, many of these publishing platforms use commenting features to allow for community engagement or even peer review, reducing the barrier to the inclusion of who can be involved in the reviewing of manuscripts. Since this growth of preprint usage, there are now servers and repositories for a wide variety of disciplines that go far beyond STEM. In this slide, I include some of the repositories and platforms listed here that UCLA has invested in as a university. This includes protocol repositories like protocols.io, data repositories like Dataverse and Dryad, code and analytics deposition platforms like Zenodo and OSF, preprint publishing platforms like bioRxiv, and platforms designed for open peer review, such as pre-review. So as you can see here, there are protocol platforms or platforms to publish these interim research products for every step of this research lifecycle. Importantly, each of the platforms that listed here have implemented standards for online archiving, such as the creation of digital object identifiers or other persistent identifiers, including research resource IDs for methods, research organization registry IDs, open researcher and contributor IDs, which help track and connect all citations in the Crossref network. So ORCID IDs are probably the ones that folks are most familiar with. While most of these platforms are not peer-reviewed, they often have mechanisms that enable some public scholarly discourse. In particular, the establishment of pre-review, which is listed here and linked here, you'll probably get access to it in the slides, was particularly notable because it made it possible to publish public reviews of preprints that are ultimately citable. For early career researchers who are entering a field, this could be an opportunity for them to make public comments, constructive comments about the relevance and impact of research without needing to have connections to journals, which is often a limiting factor to being involved as a reviewer for journals. So it appears that an increasing number of academics are moving towards a more open infrastructure, if not via the examples that I've commented on previous slides, then in other ways that I've not focused on. No matter what, rethinking the ways by which we support these mechanisms is going to be crucial. We're going to need to seriously consider how to make these platforms financially sustainable. I feel that if there is anything that we can learn through subscriptions and article processing charges that we hear about for transformative agreements, it is that pushing the cost of submission and evaluation of research to the readers or authors is problematic in different ways and creates serious issues, especially as we navigate the sea of misinformation that exists on the internet. Furthermore, journals that rely on elitism and exclusion are inherently financially unsustainable, as they require a huge amount of free labor and still rely on the rejection of others as a model for their success. You could just look at Nature's $11,000 price tag for an open access article. As we consider inclusion, misinformation, academic rigor, and financial sustainability, I've continued to reflect on a phrase that I keep coming back to, which is misinformation thrives when good information is expensive. So let's keep thinking about whose voice matters in this last section of the talk. As we think about the creators of scholarship, let's remember that there are many people who conduct legitimate and illegitimate research, that there are many who have substantial platforms and followings, both inside and outside academia. For legitimate citizen scientists to conspiracy theorists, all have a voice on the internet. Let's also remember that misinformation thrives in environments where good information is bad and the bad information, or good information is expensive and bad information is free. In traditional peer review, editors send articles to researchers in the field who are able to submit their feedback anonymously to authors. Blinding of peer review is implemented in part to protect the reviewers from retaliation for leaving unfavorable reviews. Unfortunately, not everyone asked is willing to peer review or has time to peer review all the content that is produced, and it is impossible for journals to create and maintain curated lists of excellent peer reviewers. We can just imagine a variety of consequences based on this limitation. One, journals rely on a subset of reviewers who are simply willing to respond to the call for peer review. And two, in single blind peer review, some proportion of the reviews are unprofessional or perpetuated toxic culture where cutting down research is normalized. And three, not everything gets reviewed properly, as was highlighted in the studies published in JAMA. Until now, I've been using open peer review as a general term, but I wanted to create two bins for us to work with in this presentation. A bona fide open peer review occurs when journals reveal the identities of the reviewers and the comments are published with the manuscript, and authors can directly participate in the conversations around the review and editorial decisions. Not many journals follow this model, but some are adapting aspects of this, like eLife. Here I cite, oh, right, so this was the points for open peer review. So not many journal follows this model, but some are adapting aspects of this. So here I'm citing a systematic review down here at the bottom that unpacks various definitions of open peer review, which I'm not going to cover in depth today. I'm also going to kind of define the term scholarly discourse, which is a term I consider up for debate. But for now, I'm going to say that it is any interaction or scholarly discussion that occurs between authors or reviewers, which could include anyone in the community that is considered an expert or trainee in the field on any online platform. So this could also include conference presentations and things like that. Just any conversation around the scholarship. So we've talked about the prevalence and consequences of unprofessional and incomplete reviews, and one can imagine that by creating a culture that normalizing signing and or publishing peer review alongside the article, it will reduce the chances that someone will be particularly nasty in reviews. Some publishing venues like eLife have started implementing open peer review models that follow a publish then review workflow. In the 2015 Ford F1000 research, the author discusses open peer review process of 4 STEM journals. The platform pre-review that I mentioned earlier allows people to publish open peer reviews as preprints. There's a platform called ASAP Bio that has a comprehensive publishing peer review frequently asked questions. So for people who want to get experience with kind of peer reviewing things in a constructive way, they can get experience with this here. And there is a platform called Reimagine Review, which is a registry of platforms that are all experimenting with peer review. So these are all kind of the ways in which new models of peer review are being developed in academic settings. And kind of if authors and reviewers want to kind of test out these different models, a lot of these platforms already exist. But importantly, from the perspective of inclusion, new platforms or systems are not sufficient. We need to have this culture that actively and constructively engages with research in public settings. Otherwise, if we do everything behind closed doors, it creates an environment where people can just like not trust the academy because of all of these discussions happening in the dark. So finally, I have this kind of like drawbacks and benefits slide, and I'm happy to have like a discussion on this if folks are engaged. So on preprints and open peer review as it relates to inclusion. So of the drawbacks, we can imagine unrevised works published as preprint make scholarship prone to misinformation, which is kind of in, I think many of us understand, that having some sort of model where other scholars are reviewing work improves work. Like peer review is not necessarily just the worst thing ever. It can also be difficult to manage the volume of information published, especially if we are suddenly publishing all of these research outputs. There's going to be create a problem of curation and findability of all of this content, which as such, large scale expansion of these practices is likely to be messy. But in terms of benefits, if we develop a culture that's willing to publicly engage with the scholarly discourse, then nuances of research and feedback are publicly acknowledged instead of only acknowledged behind closed doors. All of this volume of content creates new research and curation opportunities, especially in libraries. And all of the grad students and postdocs who are graduating without academic track jobs can maybe help with the process of curating this content. And then, of course, being public and open about peer review holds authors and reviewers ultimately accountable for the way that they respond to comments and for the comments that are made themselves. And then finally, using the platforms that I described earlier, it provides early career researchers a voice without unreasonable costs. Oof, so there's a lot of information in there. I really appreciate everyone's patience in hearing me out. In summary, peer review and scholarly discourse has a lot of moving parts, and we're not going to find simple solutions to changing these systems. But I do want to highlight that the research process in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, creates a variety of important research products besides just the journal article. And by valuing these other research products, we create other avenues for people to progress in and be acknowledged for their productivity in their research environments. Preprints enable the inclusion of researchers and reviewers outside of traditional academic backgrounds, which, as we think about, like I said, diversity and inclusion, includes anyone who is financially unable to participate in generating the scholarship. And then finally, open peer review and inclusive scholarly dialogue serve as this avenue for inclusion, but ultimately culture change is needed. So before we go into questions, I want to really quickly thank for all of the people who've supported me. Especially folks at the UCLA library, including my team, the Sciences User Engagement team, the Advancing Scholarly Communication team and unit, and the UCLA Library Data Sciences Center. I work with almost all these folks on a very regular basis. They've provided a lot of support. I also have to give a shout out to the Institute for Quantitative and Computational Biology and all of the collaboratory fellows for their funding, external collaborators and partners, including librarians at a variety of other UCs, and then of course, Edward for the invitation, the organizers, and of course, all of the viewers. Really appreciate you being here and just hearing me out. I'm really looking forward to the questions, and I'm happy to start taking them.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. We would now like to open it up for any questions. So we have a question. Do you have any suggestions on things academic librarians can do to help facilitate that culture change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been taking a couple of different approaches. One approach is I just, and I know that everyone has very limited time, but I often find myself going to research seminars just to like be a face and like just to listen to the different challenges that the researchers that I work with are going through. I mean, I serve as a liaison to like 30 departments, so I have a lot to pick from. And I think it's probably different in different institutions. But just being present and listening to the researchers, and kind of whenever there's like that pain point that you'd be like, oh, that could be solved by, and like writing your notes in an electronic lab notebook, or basically it's a solution oriented kind of advocacy strategy where it's like the problems already exist, and if you can kind of step in and show people this is a free solution to this problem, that's been what has been most effective for me. Whereas I don't know, sometimes like sharing this presentation like doesn't really entice the researchers I work with from time to time. So yeah, I don't know. Aside from being a friendly face who listens, like that's been the most effective. And I work with, of course, postdocs and grad students more than faculty members, because they tend to be more open to some of these ideas. And yeah.
We have another question. Another question. Any thoughts on how universities will value these publications for scholarship and promotions that may be the ultimate need for faculty?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I see it as valuable for faculty for a couple of in a couple of avenues. One is as you know, faculty are ultimately the mentors for the students that work with them. If they see these types of publications as valuable, at least for their trainees, then it makes it actually easier for the trainees to demonstrate their productivity so that they could apply for research grants. So ultimately, like publishing these can help researchers get grant funding. At least that's how it has worked in my experience and with the experience of some of my colleagues. So that's kind of one avenue. And then the other is when it comes to finding and archiving content, especially when it about publishing protocols and publishing data, a lot of these things can help the process of, like, let's say, for example, someone reaches out to your lab and asks, where can I get the data for such and such paper? If it's already in an archive or a repository, then you don't have to go hunting through the lab notebooks and the servers in the lab to find this stuff. So ultimately, it's a findability solution working with these preprints. And so I think, as more and more faculty acknowledge that there is value to publishing in these platforms, I think the question of tenure and promotion will come around. And I know that it's like a really long process, but yeah, I think that's one perspective that I have.
Would you consider the publication process to be part of automation bias?
That is a great question. I would need to like review the definition for automation bias before I commented on that question. I'm sorry.
So the next question, brilliant presentation. Can you discuss how article processing charges impact scholarly communication in this framework?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think article processing charges address one issue in publishing, which is like kind of the issue of editing, some aspects of communication and things like that. But ultimately, right now, as it stands, article processing charges are on average, especially for biomedical journals, anywhere between $1,000 and $3,000. Which, as you can imagine, for a small university in, Oklahoma, or a small university in Nevada, or like putting up $1,000 to $3,000 can be very, very, a lot of money for participating in the discourse. So I think ultimately article processing charges create a different problem in scholarly communication, while the research may be available to read, which I think is a very, very important step. Who has a voice? Ultimately, if it's who has money, then we're going back to similar problems of exclusion from before.
We have another question. Thanks for your great presentation. I came across a rapid review journal related to COVID. It's sort of halfway between peer review and unreviewed preprint. They meet each week to decide on whether articles are a trustworthy preprint. Any thoughts about this sort of hybrid model?
I am definitely in the camp, as maybe some of you can tell, of like experimenting is definitely worth a shot. And I know that there was a comment about predatory publishers, which I think is a really good one. And I think that these are kind of ultimately linked in a way. So ultimately, like the quality of scholarship you're going to find by actually reading the article and like digging through it. And I know that that takes a lot of time, and it's maybe a little bit easier to be like, okay, this journal publishes good work. But I think as we kind of consider how these different models are changing, testing out hybrid models are definitely something that researchers should just give a shot. And if the researchers themselves know that they're creating quality content, then they don't necessarily need to be worried about testing out some of these platforms. But I would be worried if once there's a lot of money involved, and this is where predatory publishers come into play. Ultimately, yeah, you have low barriers to publishing content, but the peer review quality is poor and it costs a lot of money. And so I would say, like, just for researchers who are like, okay, how do I navigate the preprint space versus predatory publishers? I don't know. It's ultimately gonna be the money. And if you're just looking for peer review, then predatory publishers, I mean, they've got you in their pocket because you want quick publishing with the peer review stamp. But if you're willing to accept the fact that some of the work that you do is not peer reviewed, then you pay less money and you don't need this kind of stamp from like whatever journal that might be trying to extract money from you.
I think you answered this, but I'm just going to read it just in case. How do predatory journals fit into all of this? Pro or con, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean, no, predatory journals definitely like capital C con, like not good. And I think predatory publishers really thrive when peer review is the standard and you just need that stamp for peer review rather than like actual discourse around the content.
And then the other one was, do you think that the issue surrounding of academic inclusion is one of the factors that motivates authors to seek out, whether knowing or unknowingly, predatory publishers to submit their work?
Yeah, I think predatory publishers will definitely, and like I'm not necessarily an expert in that kind of space of predatory publishing, but I think they'll leverage many aspects of this to like extract money from folks. And it's really sad that, and like I could imagine, some folks who are not traditionally involved with the academy want to get published in a peer-reviewed journal, and I feel like they're prime candidates for being like what's it called, victims to predatory publishing.
We have time for just a few more questions. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. And the recording will be available sometime next week, and we will share that with everyone.
I can share this link with Edward as well. I gave a version of this talk kind of in an extended form where I talk about like data publishing, methods publishing, and a little bit more about peer review and persistent identifiers as part of the Force 11 Scholarly Communication Institute. And videos of all of those talks are going to be publicly available at some point. So I can share that with Edward to share with the community if it is of interest.
Okay, we have another question. Pubmed open comments were suspected for lack or participation. New England Journal of Medicine is launching a new publication, evidence which will public phase 1 trials, hopeful signs.
I think so. It could be. I mean, I would say that regarding the lack of participation, that's definitely something that kind of is definitely a part of this this issue. One of the reasons why preprints we haven't gotten the most from preprints is because people aren't necessarily engaging with them. The platform that I mentioned earlier, pre-review, is a really great way to getting people involved in the participation process around preprints. They have this kind of movement of like, bring a preprint to your journal club and then write down all of the constructive comments, and then you can publish them as a pre-review, either as an individual or as a group. And I think that that's something that librarians can even facilitate, because all you need to do is bring in the people who are involved in that discipline, and they can bring the paper. You just kind of give them guidance on how to give a constructive review. I think that groups like that, and even the major journals that are starting with their own preprint platforms, like even Cell Press, for example, has a kind of before getting published preprint space. And there's like MLA Data, which is a data repository managed by Elsevier. I think all of these are just highlighting the fact that there is value to these types of platforms, and it's something that people should seriously consider using, whether or not we agree with the companies and their approaches. I mean, I can say that I have my own disagreements with some of these companies, but yeah, I think all of that goes to show that like the world is seeing the value in these things, and academics should too.
We have time for one more question. We have one. Given that so many publishers of biomedical journals are now accepting manuscripts that were published as preprints, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of submitting an article to a preprint server prior to submitting to a journal?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say that the major advantage is to kind of get a sense of how the greater field views your work before actually submitting it as a manuscript. And one of the things that I really like about preprints is that there's, for a lot of preprint servers, there's version control. So you can kind of create new versions and update the manuscript. One of the things that we did was through yeah, I'll just like leave it at the fact that like it's useful to get that information out there to see how the field recognizes it. And generally, the more engagement that a preprint article will get, actually there's a higher chance that it'll get accepted into a journal. So there's like an interesting way to kind of, and you can also share it with collaborators. I think if you want people to see drafts of the manuscript without like being worried about it being stolen, I feel like preprints are a really good way of like getting that publication out there and getting that like kind of timestamp of your effort instead of sharing unpublished content with people who you want feedback from. One fear that a lot of people have is that if they publish a preprint that they'll ultimately get scooped. But the kind of strange thing about like the prevalence of that fear is that because it is published content, ultimately researchers are getting credit for like being the first to publish in the preprint space because it's more rapid than publishing in journals. So that kind of fear is gonna kind of get around that. Yeah, scooping is definitely one of the major concerns, but the probability that people get scooped for publishing their data even is very low. And ultimately, because you were the source of that data, you'll need, and they're citable, you need to be cited for that effort.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, for that wonderful presentation. If you can, could you just hang around and answer any questions that may appear into the chat?
Sure.
And could you tell everyone how we could follow your work or how to keep in contact with you?
Sure. So the best email to reach me at, I should have put this on my original slide, but I just dropped it in the chat. It's Ibraheem Ali at library.ucla.edu. My LinkedIn is pretty up to date. I'll just throw a link to my LinkedIn. Oh, that's very odd to say that. Link to my LinkedIn. And I often, like any of the publishing that I do especially in like preprints or educational materials that I create around preprint education and advocacy, a lot of that stuff gets connected to my LinkedIn.
Thank you. We have just a few more items to cover today.